The evening was quiet, the kind of silence that made the wind sound louder than usual as it passed through the trees. Our family had gathered in the backyard, enjoying the cool air and the peace that came after a long day. Mom was setting out some lemonade on the table, Dad was trimming the plants, and Grandpa was sitting in his old wooden chair on the porch, rocking slowly like he always did. Nothing felt unusual at first, but then we heard it, the crunch of heavy boots against gravel, a sound none of us ever wanted to hear again. We turned our heads, and just like before, the HOA patrol was climbing our fence, their shadows stretching long under the setting sun. They didn't knock, they didn't call out, they simply acted as if our home belonged to them. My little sister clutched Mom's hand tightly while Dad's jaw clenched in anger. We had told them many times, begged them to stay away, but they never listened. Each visit felt like another insult, another way to remind us that they thought we had no power, no right to resist their rules. Grandpa watched quietly, his eyes narrowing as the men landed in our yard with smug grins on their faces. One of them called out that they were here to check for violations, as if that gave them the right to invade our lives. Dad stepped forward, his voice firm as he told them to leave, but they only laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. I could see Mom's hands trembling as she held onto my sister, and for a moment I felt the same helplessness as before, the kind that burned deep inside but had nowhere to go. Grandpa, however, did not shout or argue. He simply pushed himself up from his chair, slower than usual, and disappeared inside the house. At first, I thought he was avoiding the fight, but something about the way he walked made me curious. His back was straight, his step steady, and when the door closed behind him, I could see the faintest smile on his face. Dad kept arguing with the patrol, but I slipped away, peeking through the window to see what Grandpa was up to. He went straight to the garage, a place filled with old tools, boxes, and memories of his younger days. I watched as he pulled a heavy wooden box from the shelf, one covered in dust and cobwebs, as though it hadn't been touched in years. When he opened it, my heart skipped a beat. Inside were thick coils of wire, old tools, and something that looked like an electric meter. Grandpa wiped the dust away and touched the wires gently, almost with affection, like he was greeting an old friend. Outside, the patrol was still circling the yard, pointing at random things, pretending to take notes while Dad's patience wore thin. But Grandpa wasn't paying attention to them anymore. His hands were steady as he picked up the wires, his eyes sharp with focus I hadn't seen in a long time. It was like a different man stood in that garage, one with a plan, one who had been waiting for this moment. When he came back out, he didn't go toward the patrol. Instead, he carried the box to the far side of the porch and placed it down with care. The men outside didn't even notice him. They were too busy mocking Dad and making a show of their so-called authority. But I noticed. I saw the way Grandpa crouched low, running the wire along the edge of the gate, measuring it carefully. Every movement was precise, deliberate. I didn't fully understand what he was building, but I could sense it wasn't something the patrol would enjoy. Mom finally called my name, pulling me back to the group, and I pretended like I hadn't been watching. The patrol left after a few more minutes of empty threats, promising they would return soon to finish their inspection. Dad looked exhausted, his face heavy with frustration. But when I glanced at Grandpa, sitting back in his chair as if nothing had happened, I noticed something different. His eyes were calm, but behind that calm was a fire. He wasn't afraid, and he wasn't tired. He was planning. That night, long after the patrol had gone, I watched Grandpa sneak back outside with a lantern. He didn't know I was awake, didn't see me peering through the window as he worked. The faint glow of sparks flickered near the gate, and the sound of tools echoed softly in the night. Grandpa leaned over the fence, adjusting the wires, testing the connections, his face lit by the glow. It was the first time I realized he wasn't just defending his home, he was preparing a lesson. And when he finally stood back, wiping the sweat from his brow and staring at the gate with quiet satisfaction, I understood one thing clearly. The next time the HOA came over our fence, they would not leave the same way they entered. The next morning the sun rose quietly over our yard, but the air felt different, heavy with something I couldn't explain, as if the ground itself knew what Grandpa had started the night before. Breakfast was silent, Mom's eyes darting toward Grandpa, who sat calmly at the table sipping his tea, his face unreadable, while Dad kept muttering under his breath about the HOA and their endless intrusions. My little sister asked if the bad men would come back, and Grandpa only gave her a small smile, telling her not to worry, that the fence was stronger than they thought. His words should have calmed us, but instead they made us wonder what he truly meant. Later that afternoon, I saw him walking slowly toward the gate with a coil of wire in his hands, his lantern hanging from the porch even though the sun was still bright. Neighbors across the street began whispering, watching him as if they too felt something unusual brewing. One even asked Dad what Grandpa was doing, but Dad only shrugged, not knowing the full plan himself. Grandpa spent hours near the fence, measuring, twisting wires, and tapping on the wooden posts with his hammer. At times faint sparks would dance, barely visible in the daylight, and though Mom looked uneasy, Grandpa's calm expression never changed. It was as if he had done this before, as if this was not the first time he had prepared for unwanted visitors. As the day turned to evening, the work continued. We tried to call him inside for dinner, but he waved us away, saying he wasn't hungry. He was focused, more focused than I had ever seen him, and the determination in his eyes made my heart beat faster. My sister whispered that Grandpa was building something secret, something the patrol would not like, and though I wanted to correct her, I knew deep down she was right. When night finally fell, the yard looked ordinary, quiet like always. Yet when I stood near the porch, I could hear the faint hum of energy coming from the gate. It was not loud, just a low, steady sound, but enough to make the hairs on my arms rise. Grandpa had pulled his chair closer to the porch rail, a lantern glowing beside him, and he sat there silently, staring at the gate as if waiting for someone. He didn't speak much to us that night, only nodding when Dad asked if everything was safe. There was something unsettling yet comforting about his silence, like he had already planned every step and knew exactly how it would end. The neighbors kept peeking through their curtains, some of them whispering that Grandpa had gone too far, others curious if he really had the courage to stand up to the HOA. But Grandpa didn't care about their opinions. He only cared about the gate, the wires, and the quiet promise he had made to himself to protect us. Around midnight, I woke again and peeked through the window. Grandpa hadn't moved. He sat there on the porch, rocking slowly, the lantern's flame flickering across his face, his eyes sharp and unblinking as they stayed locked on the gate. Every now and then a small spark would light up the wire, vanishing just as quickly, and though the sound was faint, it carried an edge of danger that made my stomach tighten. It was in that moment I realized this wasn't just about stopping trespassers. This was personal for him. Each time the HOA had crossed our fence, they had disrespected not only our home but Grandpa's honor. And now he was preparing to remind them that our family was not as weak as they believed. The night stretched on, but Grandpa never looked tired. Instead, he seemed stronger, almost energized by the idea of facing them. His patience was frightening, like a hunter waiting for prey, and even though nothing happened that night, I could feel that the storm was coming. The patrol would return, it was only a matter of time. And when they did, they would find not the quiet old man they thought they knew, but someone far more dangerous, someone who had turned silence into strength. As I closed my eyes trying to sleep, the hum of the gate echoed in my ears, and one thought burned deep in my mind. Grandpa wasn't just waiting, he was daring them to come. The morning air carried a strange weight, as if the world itself was holding its breath. And though the sun shone brightly, the yard did not feel the same as before because the quiet hum of the gate lingered in the background, whispering of something dangerous and waiting. Dad tried to distract himself with his usual chores, trimming the bushes and watering the plants, but his eyes kept flicking nervously toward the fence, while Mom tried to keep my little sister inside, pretending everything was fine though her trembling hands told the truth. Grandpa, however, was calm as ever, seated in his chair on the porch with a cup of tea in hand, watching the gate as though it were an old friend he knew inside and out. Hours passed without incident, but then, just as the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the sky, the sound of heavy boots once again shattered the peace. The HOA patrol was back. Their voices were loud, their laughter sharp, echoing over the fence before their figures appeared, climbing the same way they always did, showing no respect for the property they had trespassed on so many times before. This time they were more arrogant, calling out that they were here for an inspection, claiming we were hiding violations, as if those words gave them the right to walk into our lives. Dad stormed forward, his voice louder than I had ever heard, telling them they had no right, no permission, but his anger only made them smirk. One patrolman, tall with a mocking grin, stepped closer to the gate, resting his hand casually on the metal bars as though daring Grandpa to stop him. My breath caught in my throat, because I knew what Grandpa had done to that gate. I knew it was no longer just a fence, it was a trap waiting for the foolish. For a moment the yard went silent, everyone watching as the man pressed his palm harder against the gate. And then it happened. A sharp crackle of electricity burst from the metal, a flash of blue light snapping through the air. The patrolman yanked his hand back with a curse. His smug smile wiped away, replaced by shock and fear as his companions stepped back in alarm. Grandpa didn't move from his chair, didn't raise his voice. He only sipped his tea and looked at them with steady eyes that said more than words ever could. The message was clear. This was no longer their playground. Mom gasped softly, clutching my sister, while Dad stood frozen, torn between pride and worry at what had just happened. For the first time, the patrol looked uncertain, their arrogance cracking as they whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between the gate and Grandpa. But instead of leaving quietly, they grew angry, embarrassed by the way an old man had made them look weak. One of them barked into a radio, calling for backup, and within minutes 3 more men arrived, stepping through the street with stern faces and heavy boots. The tension grew unbearable, the air thick with fear and defiance as our family stood together, hearts pounding, watching the patrol gather in front of the gate. Grandpa finally set down his teacup, leaned forward slightly in his chair, and for the first time that day spoke, his voice calm but sharp like a blade. "This is private property. Leave now." The words seemed to cut deeper than the shock had, and for a moment the patrol hesitated, shifting nervously under his gaze. Yet their pride would not let them retreat. Not yet. They muttered threats, saying the board would hear of this, that our family would face consequences. Grandpa only stared back, unflinching, his silence louder than their words. The standoff stretched, the setting sun casting long shadows across the yard, and I felt my chest tighten with both fear and awe. Then, suddenly, the leader of the patrol sneered, vowing that this was far from over, and with that they turned and stormed off, their boots pounding against the ground, their angry voices fading into the distance. Relief washed over me, but only for a moment, because deep inside I knew this was just the beginning. They would return, stronger and angrier, unwilling to accept the humiliation of being outsmarted by Grandpa. As the yard grew quiet once again, Grandpa leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving the gate, and the hum of the wires filled the silence like a warning bell. I realized then that the first warning had been given, and though the patrol had left with their pride wounded, they would not stay away for long. Something darker was coming, and Grandpa was already preparing for it. The next day began with a heavy silence, a silence so thick it felt like the whole neighborhood was waiting for something to happen. And though the sky was bright and clear, none of us could shake the tension pressing on our chests. Mom tried to keep things normal by cooking breakfast, but her hands trembled when she set the plates down, while Dad barely touched his food, his eyes locked on the window as if expecting the HOA patrol to appear at any moment. My little sister asked if the bad men were coming again, and Dad forced a smile that fooled no one. Grandpa, however, was the only one who looked at peace, sitting in his chair on the porch as usual, his tea steaming gently in the cool morning air, his gaze steady on the gate. He looked almost amused, like a fisherman waiting patiently for a stubborn catch. And though his calmness eased me a little, it also made me nervous because I knew he was planning for something bigger. By afternoon the whispers began again, neighbors stepping onto their porches, pointing, murmuring that more patrol cars had been seen nearby, that the HOA was angry and planning something. Dad grew restless, pacing the yard, checking locks and latches, while Mom begged Grandpa to stop provoking them. But Grandpa only gave her that small smile of his, the kind that carried both comfort and defiance. Then, just as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the lawn, the sound came again. The crunch of boots, the low voices, the mocking laughter. The HOA had returned, and this time there were more of them. Not just 3 or 4 but nearly a dozen, gathering outside the fence with grim faces and sharp eyes. They shouted threats, waving papers in the air, claiming we were breaking rules, violating codes, daring us to challenge them. My heart pounded as they marched closer, some trying to push against the gate, others circling around like wolves testing their prey. Grandpa didn't flinch. He stayed in his chair, calm as ever, watching with eyes that saw through their anger. Dad finally shouted for them to leave, his voice cracking with both rage and fear, but they only laughed louder, taunting him, calling him weak. Then one of them made a bold move, trying to climb the fence from the far side, avoiding the gate as if they knew something was waiting there. For a moment my breath caught, but then I saw Grandpa's lips curl into a faint grin. Suddenly a sharp crackle split the air, not from the gate but from the top of the fence itself, where Grandpa had hidden another set of wires. The man yelped, jerking back in shock as sparks danced across the metal, and the rest of the patrol froze, stunned by the trap. Gasps rose from the neighbors watching through their curtains, some whispering in awe, others ducking back in fear. Mom covered my sister's eyes while Dad stared at Grandpa in disbelief, realizing he had thought of everything. The patrol cursed loudly, their pride wounded once more, and for a moment they looked ready to retreat. But then their leader, a tall man with cold eyes, stepped forward and pointed a finger at us. His voice was low but dangerous as he promised this would not end here, that we would regret humiliating them, and that the entire board would come down on our family. My stomach twisted as his words echoed across the yard, a chilling promise that felt heavier than any shout. Slowly, reluctantly, the patrol backed away, but their glares burned into us like fire. They did not leave in silence. They muttered threats, vowing to return, vowing to crush the stubborn old man who dared defy them. As they disappeared into the night, the air felt heavier than before, charged not just with electricity but with dread of what was coming. Grandpa finally set his cup down, his face calm, but his eyes shone with something fierce, something unshakable. He had stood his ground, proven his strength, but I could see in his gaze that he knew this was only the beginning. The battle had started, and the enemy would not stop until they had either broken us or been broken themselves. As I lay awake that night, listening to the low hum of the wires and the distant murmur of uneasy neighbors, one thought clung to my mind. The HOA was angry now, and when they returned, it would not be with just threats. The morning of the next day carried no peace, only the heavy silence of a family waiting for a storm they could not stop. And though the birds still sang and the sky was clear, our hearts were unsettled because we knew the HOA would not forgive what had happened, not after being embarrassed twice in front of neighbors. Dad tried to stay strong, pacing the house and checking the locks again and again. But I could see the worry in his eyes, and Mom barely spoke, her face pale as she cooked food no one touched. My little sister clung to her doll, asking if the bad men would take our house, and none of us knew what to answer. Only Grandpa remained calm, seated on the porch with his steady gaze fixed on the gate, his chair rocking slowly, his tea untouched as if he was conserving his patience for the moment it would be needed most. Around noon we began to hear it, the distant rumble of engines, the stomp of heavy boots, and soon the street outside filled with the largest HOA group we had ever seen. There were not just a handful this time but more than 20, their leader standing tall in the center with a cruel smile that sent shivers through me. They carried tools, crowbars, and even ladders, as if ready to tear our yard apart, and their voices rose in unison, shouting threats, mocking us, daring Grandpa to stop them now. Neighbors peeked through windows, some filming quietly with their phones, others hiding behind curtains, too scared to get involved. Dad shouted for them to leave, his voice cracking, but the patrol ignored him, marching forward with the arrogance of men who thought victory was already theirs. Then they reached the gate, pounding on it with fists and tools, demanding it be opened. For a moment the yard shook under their force, and Mom gasped as she pulled my sister close, but Grandpa only leaned forward slightly. his eyes narrowing as the wires along the gate began to hum louder than ever. I held my breath, the world slowing down as the leader shouted, "Break it down!" And his men pushed harder. That was when it happened. The entire fence lit up in a sudden blaze of blue sparks, crackling like lightning, snapping through the metal with a terrifying roar. The men jumped back in shock, some stumbling onto the street, their shouts turning to curses as they clutched their hands. The smell of burning metal filled the air, and the sound of electricity echoed so loudly it seemed the whole neighborhood could hear it. My heart pounded with both fear and pride, because Grandpa had done it again. He had turned their arrogance into humiliation. But the confrontation was far from over. The leader snarled, his face twisted with rage, and pointed directly at Grandpa, shouting that this was a crime, that we would pay dearly, that this would go all the way to the top of the board. His voice carried such venom that even Dad faltered, stepping back uncertainly. Still, Grandpa did not move. He rose slowly from his chair, his old joints creaking but his back straight, and walked to the edge of the porch. His voice was calm, almost too calm, as he said, "This is my home. You will not cross this gate again." The words hung heavy in the air, stronger than any threat, and for a brief moment even the patrol went silent, their anger colliding with something they had not expected, unshakable resolve. Then the leader spat on the ground, promising this was not the end, promising that tonight, after dark, they would come back, and they would not leave until they had destroyed everything we had built. With that, the patrol finally turned away, their boots pounding against the road as they marched off, their laughter gone, replaced by mutters of vengeance. The neighbors whispered among themselves, some glancing at Grandpa with awe, others with fear, but none dared approach. As the street emptied and silence returned, I looked at Grandpa, standing tall against the setting sun, his face unreadable yet filled with something powerful. Mom hugged my sister tightly, Dad wiped sweat from his forehead, but I could not take my eyes off him. He was no longer just an old man sitting in a rocking chair. He was a soldier, a guardian, someone who had drawn a line in the dirt and dared the world to cross it. The confrontation had ended, but the war had just begun. And as night fell over our home, the hum of the gate sounded louder than ever, like the beating of a war drum that warned us all of the battles still to come. The night came heavy and slow, the air thick with tension, as if even the wind knew what was about to unfold. And though the stars glittered above the yard felt darker than ever, shadows stretching across the ground while our family sat together in silence. Mom held my sister close, whispering prayers under her breath, while Dad paced near the door, his fists clenched but his face pale, every sound from outside making him flinch. I sat by the window, staring at the gate that glowed faintly with sparks, its low hum vibrating in my chest like the heartbeat of some sleeping beast. And there was Grandpa, calm as always, seated on his porch chair with his lantern burning beside him, the flame casting long lines across his weathered face. His eyes locked on the street as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. Hours passed, and then the sound came, faint at first but growing louder, the distant roar of engines, the heavy rhythm of boots, the voices of men chanting in anger. My blood ran cold as the HOA patrol returned. But this time it was not just a group of men. It was nearly an army, their leader marching at the front with a cruel smile that looked more like a promise of destruction. They carried ladders, crowbars, tools, even large floodlights that turned the street into a stage of war, their shadows stretching tall and monstrous against the houses. Neighbors peeked from windows, their phones glowing as they recorded, but none dared step outside, too afraid of what was about to happen. The patrol stopped in front of our yard, their voices booming as they shouted threats, mocking Grandpa, calling him a foolish old man who would regret standing against them. Mom began to cry quietly. Dad muttered that this was too much, that we could not fight them all, but Grandpa remained still, his hand resting on the arm of his chair, his eyes unblinking as he stared at the gate. Then, slowly, he stood, his old body straightening as if strength flowed back into his bones, and he stepped forward until the lantern light shone across his face. His voice was calm but carried like thunder when he spoke. "This is my land. You will not cross." The patrol erupted in laughter, some shaking their tools, others chanting that the fence would fall. But then something unexpected happened. From the shadows at the edges of the street came movement. Our neighbors, the same ones who had whispered in fear for days, now stepping out with flashlights and cameras, some even holding sticks or tools, gathering quietly behind Grandpa. They had seen enough, they had heard enough, and though they were afraid, their eyes carried the same fire that burned in Grandpa's. The HOA faltered for a moment, surprised by the sudden crowd, but their pride pushed them forward, and with a shout their leader ordered the men to advance. Boots stomped, ladders were lifted, crowbars slammed against the gate, and the air filled with the roar of chaos. Then the wires screamed to life. Sparks exploded across the fence like a storm, blue lightning dancing along the metal, the crackle so loud it drowned out the shouts. Men cried out, stumbling back, their tools ripped from their hands by the surge of energy, and the ladders crashed to the ground as flames flickered at their edges. The smell of smoke filled the night, the sound of burning mingled with curses and fear. Still, some pushed forward, desperate to prove their strength, but Grandpa had prepared for this final stand. He flipped a switch on the lantern beside him, and suddenly the ground near the gate lit up with a hidden trap, wires coiled beneath the soil that sparked alive, forcing the patrol to retreat further, their leader shouting in rage as his men scrambled. The neighbors cheered, their voices rising for the first time, shouting support for Grandpa, clapping, chanting that the patrol should leave. The leader's cruel smile was gone, replaced by a look of disbelief and fury, his pride shattered under the weight of defeat. He pointed at Grandpa, his voice trembling with anger as he swore this wasn't finished. But the words sounded hollow now, swallowed by the chants of the crowd and the crackle of the fence. Finally, with a barked order, he turned and stormed off, his army following behind, their heads low, their threats empty. Silence fell heavy after they were gone, broken only by the hum of the wires and the quiet sob of relief from Mom. Dad sank into a chair, his face pale but his eyes filled with pride, and my sister finally let go of her doll to clap her small hands together. Grandpa said nothing. He only sat back down in his chair, staring at the gate with the same steady eyes, his lantern glowing by his side. For a long time no one spoke, no one moved, but deep inside we all knew what had happened. The HOA had been broken, their arrogance shattered, and it was Grandpa who had done it. The old man they mocked, the man they thought was weak, had turned his silence into strength, his patience into power, and his wisdom into the deadliest weapon of all, resolve. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the soft hum of the gate and the faint cheers of neighbors drifting through the air, I realized the truth. We were no longer just a family under attack. We were a family united, defended by a man who had refused to bow, and though the battle had ended, the story would never be forgotten.